Well, welcome and thank you for joining us this week for our devotional. A while ago, I went on a camping trip with some individuals, and we got to our campsite, got everything set up, and we made the campfire. And the person that was in charge of the campfire made the campfire, and they just put a few logs in there. And it was one of those fires they had to set really close to in order to try to gain any warmth. And so me being a little bit more cold-blooded, I'm kind of like shivering there by the fire. And a little bit later, some other people gather or come to join us, and they say, that's not a fire, and they throw more logs on, and the fire gets bigger and roaring, and the warmth of that heat that I could get from that fire, and you could take a step back a little bit, and the fire was more productive. It was doing more of the work that it should do. And that reminds me a lot of what we read in the book of 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy in the first chapter, starting in verse 6. Paul, talking to Timothy, says, "For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." I love that imagery that Paul gives to Timothy, fan into flames. Right? We can have this little fire going here, and you blow more air onto it, and it increases the flame that is going on. And that is the thing that Paul is using for Timothy to speak in our spiritual journey as well. That we have been given a gift by God. In Timothy's case, it was evident on the laying on of hands. Some of us might not be as relating to that, but we have a gift that God has given us, and we have recognized that into our lives. And Paul is saying, take that gift and fan it into flame. Put energy behind that so it becomes roaring, right? Some of us might feel like we're in that state of that original campfire that I talked about, where we're just slowly burning. Yeah, we're doing some good work, but if we would fan into flame and build it up, what more we could do, what more we could be doing for the Lord and be seen with the ministries that are lying before us. And so we want to take that encouragement of Paul as well and say, how do we fan into flame our gifts? How do we take what God has given us and use them to their fullest potential, so we're not just lightly burning there, where we bring some work, but not as much as maybe we were meant to bring. And so that latter part in verse 7 there is how Paul tells us how to navigate that. He tells us that God didn't give us a spirit of fear. That is the thing that's going to hold us back the most from doing what God has called us to do. Now again, we don't want to overemphasize fear. There is a rational understanding of potential threats and dangers, and that's not irrational. Say you've had issues before in the past with over drinking, and you have an opportunity to go witness at a bar. You might be like, that's not a good environment for me to go into, because I'm afraid that I'm going to succumb to my past and want to start drinking, and I don't know if I'll be able to keep myself from drinking too much. That's a legitimate fear. That's not a fear that's debilitating. That's a fear of going, I know who I am, I know my struggles, and I'm going to take precautions there. So don't get that confused. It's not saying jump into every kind of situation. Otherwise, what is the point of discernment, right? God gives us discernment sometimes and say, this might not be a good area for me to go into. That's not fear. That's discernment and knowing who we are and what we do. But we have to be very careful of those debilitating fears where we know what we are called to do, but we don't want to go down there. In those times, it's most evident because we're going to try to convince ourselves why we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, or try to justify why we're not doing what we're doing. But we have what, I think it's Isaiah that talks about it, that fire inside our bones, where we just can't shake this. We have this overwhelming sense this is what I should do, but we're doing everything in our power to try to convince ourselves we don't have to do that. That's living in fear, and that's what we don't want to do. And what Paul is telling Timothy and Paul is telling you and I through this passage is that's not from the Lord. When you're trying to convince yourself not to do something you feel like you should do, that's not God trying to direct you, Paul's saying. All right? So you don't have to sit back and go, well, maybe God is trying to tell me I shouldn't be doing this, and this is why I have these feelings coming up into my mind. No, Paul says, no. God doesn't give that spirit of fear. So if fear is holding you back from doing what God is calling you to do, it is not God that's doing it. It is our flesh, right? Remember, we have our spirit that is willing to do the will of God, but our flesh is weak, our sinful nature. And there's that battle going on between the two. And so sometimes that flesh is bringing in the fear factor that's trying to pull us back from what God is asking us to do. So first off, fear is not from the Lord. But what are we given then? We're given power. Power from God. Power to do what He has called us to do. Sorry, I got a bee hanging out with me here. An illustration there of a little bit of fear, right? Can't tell, I have a little bit of a phobia of bees, so probably a little irrational there. Probably shouldn't be trying to duck from a bee that's just hanging around me, but I'm being overcome with their fear. So there, just had my own application there. I'm going to try to stand firm and not freak out with the bee that's buzzing around me. So He gives us power, all right? So let's see if He can give me the power to overcome this bee that's hanging out with me here. He gives us power, and it comes from God. And we see an example of this in Philippians in chapter 4, especially in verse 13, where Paul talks about the hardships that he's going through and how God allows him to overcome all those things. He says, whether I have plentiful in amount of food, I can minister in that. If I have a lack of food, I can minister there too, because God is going to strengthen me no matter what my circumstances are. So we can have great comfort knowing that God is going to empower us. I mean, this is huge because remember, the fear factor is what's going to try to hold us back. It can be, I don't know if they'll accept the message that I have to say. I don't know if I'm going to be ridiculed by what they have to say. On and on and on. All these fears that we have. And those are going to hold us back from wanting to do what God is asking us to do. Think of it like if I had a block of wood here that I was going to do for the fireplace. I could sit here and convince myself all day long I will not be able to split that piece of wood. So if I convince myself I will not be able to do it, I'll never try. So therefore I'll never succeed. But if I say, I don't think I can do it, but I'm going to go through the motions anyways because, in this case, if you can follow the analogy, God is calling me to do it, I can go through. And maybe the log will break because God gave me the power to do that. Maybe it doesn't break. And I'm like, see, I knew. Why did I even try? But maybe the point wasn't actually to split the log. Right? God's ways are beyond our ways. Maybe I thought, okay, this is what God is doing. He's going to want me to split the log. I don't think the log will be able to be split. It doesn't split. I'm like, see, there, it must have not been the Lord. But maybe the whole point wasn't splitting the log, right? So use this in a real life scenario. Maybe you feel overwhelmed to witness to somebody. You're like, man, this isn't going to work. They're going to never listen to me. But you go through the motions. You go and you witness to them, and they walk away infuriated at you. Not listening to a thing you say, and you go, oh my goodness, I knew I shouldn't have done that. I don't know why I went through those motions. But maybe you still did exactly what God asked you to do. He never told you to convert them and win them. That's between them and God. But He asked you to talk to them, and you did do that. So sometimes we convince ourselves not to do something because we're trying to do it in our own strength. But we have to remember God's the one that empowers us. A quote that I hold on to from Warren Wiersbe whenever doing ministry. And I know I've said it before, and I hope some of you that's heard it before have been holding on to it as well. He says, God did not call us to be manufacturers of His gifting, just distributors. Right? We don't have to come up with all the novel ideas, all the ways to get people saved and reach them. Yeah, we're a part of that conversation with God. He might put those ideas on our minds, but we don't have to manufacture these things. God just gives us the stuff. Here's my word. Here's what I'm putting on your heart at this moment. Here's what you learned through a message on Sunday or a Bible study you read or whatever it might be. And He's giving you resources, and He's just saying, now go distribute those. Many times it's the exact day that these situations happen in our lives that He has resourced us. So He's saying, I'm just calling you to distribute these things, not to have to try to figure it out on your own. So he's going to give us the power then to do those things. But if we always say, no, I'm incapable of doing it, how will we ever see his power go in line with that? I hope you understand that concept, right? The axe can't split the wood until somebody wields the axe to do it. So God is the power behind the axe, but we have to be the willing axe to be yielded. If we refuse to be used, we're broken, then God cannot yield us. So we have to go through the motions in order to see the power of God at work. And he gives us love, right? The spirit of love there. So we don't have fear. We have power from him, and he's given us a spirit of love. And that's so important, right? What's the two greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God and love others better than yourself. If we can't get those two down, if we don't rely on him for those things, we'll never be able to do ministry. Because why are we going to ever step out of our comfort zone if we're not willing to do it for God? That has to be our number one priority, to say whatever I'm doing on this earth, it has to be bringing glory to God. Because if I won't do it for that, then there's going to be no motivation except for selfishness to do anything. And we have to have love for others. Because, yeah, our ultimate thing is to serve God, but in serving God, we're serving people. And so that's the physical thing that we're going to see in front of us. So you have to love the people. Even if that's not your ultimate goal is to serve the Lord, you still have to love the people, because that's that's the ones that you're going to be surrounded by in doing these things. And the people aren't always going to be the most loving back, right? It can be hard. Everybody's in a different walk in their life. Some of them, like, again, not to overuse Wiersbe's quotes, but are the little hedgehogs in our lives, right? Cute and cuddly until you get a little close, and then sometimes you get poked. But he says those are the people who need us the most. And so we don't run away from them. We say those are the ones that God is calling me to minister to, because they're maybe hurting or broken somehow, or need to be reached with the gospel, or whatever it might be in that situation. So again, we're not going to conjure up this love ourselves. We are fallen individuals, right? We can try really hard to love other people, but there's going to come a breaking point where we feel like I just can't love them anymore. That's human, that's flesh. But God says, I'll give you the spirit of love. I'll get you through this. And he gives us encouragement through his word of serving him and not people, but it is serving people, but how to understand where they're coming from, where they're at, and why we serve them there. So if you feel like you're getting to the point where you're like, I just can't deal with people anymore. And again, you might have stuck a sideline and you're trying to do it on your own power instead of God. Search out his word. Take time to sit down and say, God, be honest with him. He already knows your heart. God, I'm struggling with this. Help me love people again. Bring it out into your word and read until he brings to light to your mind things in that nature. So we don't get fear. We have power. He's going to help give us that spirit of love and of self-control. Self-control is an interesting concept. The lack of self-control is spoken about in Proverbs 25, verse 28, where it's likened to a city without walls. It says, a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. Walls speak of the defense of the city, protection. When you don't have self-control, there's nothing that's protecting your reputation, your character, because you just go off on whim. So you have no protection on there. And what you end up doing is, because you have no control, you end up becoming very angry. You say things you shouldn't say. You do things you shouldn't do. Whatever it might be. And you burn bridges along the way with connections with people. People become where they want to avoid you. And in essence, it's a beautiful picture of, think of the Raz city that has been attacked by an enemy and is smoldering, and all the buildings are burnt down. It's a mess. And when we don't have self-control, that's what our lives become. It's chaos. And do you want to go and visit that city? Is that the place when you make a vacation go, yeah, we're going to go to the city that was just pillaged? No, you want to avoid that. Well, that's what it's going to be like as a human being too. If that's your life without self-control, do you think people are going to want to be friends with you or to hang out with you or see who you are. No. There's a lot of destruction there. They want joy. They want relaxation, right? And so we don't want to fall in that category. We don't have self-control. So by the grace of God, right, he gives us the spirit of self-control. And this is shown a good example of it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. Right? The whole point of our self-control is we're doing something far greater than anything that is of earthly value. It is something that is eternal that we are striving for. So what's the point of the athlete? It takes self-control to push yourself to do things you don't want to do. Right? To become better at your sport, you have to train. And that is hard to do because you have to push your body beyond what it's comfortable doing to be able to make muscles and strengthen to be able to become better. Self-control as a human being, we have to push ourselves to do things that we normally wouldn't want to do or don't feel comfortable doing, right? I am uncomfortable getting into this conversation, but I'm going to have control over myself to push myself into that area so I can grow. And eventually, this won't be actually all that hard to do, right? I have a really hard time bringing up God in a conversation, but I'm going to have control over myself, and I'm going to bring up God in a conversation. And as I continue to train myself to do that, it's not going to seem all that bad in the long run. And I can keep pushing myself further and further and further. I'm going to have control over myself. And again, this isn't just our doing it on our own, right? The whole point of this passage is God has given us the Spirit to do these things. It's amazing what we can overcome, but we have to be willing to do it. And that's the key ingredient for you and I. We have to fan into flame. God will empower us to do these things. He will give us the ability to do them. We just have to fan it into flame. Sometimes we have to take that one moment of awkwardness in order to jumpstart the process, to show that we're not afraid, that we trust God, that He's going to get us through this moment. Otherwise, we're like the broken splitting maul that God cannot use. Right? His power is useless because there's not an instrument to be used. But as long as we're a willing instrument, God can use us to do the work that He has called us to do. So that's just our role. We can be encouraged that the fear that we have is not from God. He's going to give us the power to do it. He's going to help us love the people through it. And He's going to help us to control ourselves in the moment. We just have to take that step. A concept that I've been clinging to lately with all the hard decisions and thoughts that have to go through in life and the worry of making the wrong one is resting on God doesn't ask us to be perfect, but He asks us to be faithful. We might let our flesh overpower us in certain circumstances and not do as good as what we could have done. But you know what? God just asked us to be faithful. Look at the early disciples, right, that Jesus had. They made some mistakes. But God didn't ask them to be perfect. He asked them to be faithful. Follow me, and He still used them. And they grew in the process, right? The disciples are totally different of what they were at the beginning than what they were at the end. And a huge part of that is the Holy Spirit coming upon them. And we have that part already. So let's go out and not hold back from what God is asking us to do, but to recognize that we have the power, the love, and the self-control that's going to come from God. Thank you for joining us this week. We won't have a midweek video next week because I will be on vacation. So I hope you find some time to sit down and read your Bible or devotional for that time. But I'm looking forward to connecting with you again in a couple weeks. Have a great one.